Welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us once more, and especially for being with us today for the last session of this year of Fixing the Future, the online event dedicated to exploring the future of education together with some of the most inspiring voices of the education world. In the previous sessions, we traveled from Ahmedabad to New York. We talked about the international challenges of the education system, as well as of the opportunities within higher education. We understood the key role of the teachers in lightening the flames of their pupils, and we questioned the efficiency of the standardized tests, as well as we explored instead the potentialities of neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Today we are going to close this series by extending the conversation to the whole learning ecosystem, also beyond schools. And we will do this with the best-selling author and the government consultant David Price, who will be talking with Liliana Arroyo, who holds a PhD in sociology and is a researcher at the ESADE Institute for Social Innovation. Remember that today is your last opportunity to interact live with our guests, so be sure to put your questions in the chat box so Liliana can introduce them in the conversation. So, welcome Liliana.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Bona tarda a tothom pels que ens sentiu en català. It's my pleasure to be hosting this session today along with David Price. I don't know where to start in order to introduce him because he's a really well-known author, but he likes to present himself as the expert in organizational learning for a complex future. He's co-founder of We Do Things Differently, a UK culture consultancy. In 2009, he also was awarded an OBE for services to education. He writes, he talks, he trains and advises around the world on some of the biggest challenges facing business, education, and society, solving the problems of employee, student, and civic needs engagement, maximizing our potential to be creative, innovative, and fulfilled citizens, and understanding the global shift towards open organizations and system of learning. David is also the author of Open: How We Will Work, Live, and Learn in the Future, published in 2013. And he has recently published The Power of Us, How We Connect, Act, and Innovate Together. Good afternoon, David. How are you? Thank you for joining us today.
Hola, Liliana. Buenas tardes. ¿Qué tal? That was a little image of the whole year. You need to unmute. It's probably the most used expression in the whole of this past 12 months.
Definitely, a very good summary of this year.
Yep.
So you have recently published The Power of Us. For those who are not familiar with the book, could you briefly explain what can we find in it?
Sure. Well, there's kind of four threads that interweave throughout the book. The first one is the reemergence of what I call user innovation. This is not a new phrase. Professor Eric von Hippel at MIT was talking about this about 10 years ago. But what it means is that people now are making their own products and creating their own services. 54% of all new products and services are developed by the users. And this wouldn't have been unusual. Everything before the Industrial Revolution could be said to be as a result of user innovation. But of course, with mass industrialization came the dominance of what I call the producer mindset. And we saw this in the commercial world, but we also saw it in education. But what happened, it seems to me, is about 15 years ago, we started sharing what we knew, which was my first book, Open. And through the kind of open learning revolution, that led to sharing what we owned. And so we saw the growth of the sharing economy. So it's perhaps not so surprising that we would then be into this phase that we're now in, which is sharing what we make. And if anyone needs to get a glimpse of what this looks like, they should just go on websites like Etsy or Patreon. It's what's been described as the artisanal economy, and it is where most of our young people will be looking for work in the future. So that's the first thread. The second one is that communities are outperforming bureaucracies, and we had no better example of that than at the start of this pandemic, when governments all around the world were failing to supply medical workers with PPE. But we had community groups in the UK that were called scrub hubs, thousands of people who were making medical gowns. We had school kids who were creating 3D printed face shields for doctors. And so they were actually working quicker than government. And we've now got legions of citizen scientists, citizen journalists, biohackers, people who even hack furniture. And there is a kind of impatience about these groups. One of these groups has a hashtag which is "We are not waiting." And they're no longer seeking permission from the regulatory authorities to be able to do this, to be able to create these new products and services. So that's the second thread. The third thread, I think, is perhaps the most interesting one, which is the rise of social activism. We've seen more mass movements in the past 10 years than we had in the previous 200. And the exciting part for me as an educator is that many of these have been led by young people. The two biggest public demonstrations in the history of our species happened in the past 2 years. One was organized by Greta Thunberg and her school friends, and the other was the kids from Parklands, Florida, in the March for Our Lives, the gun control marches. So we're seeing this rise of activism, and it's more networked, it's better organized. If you think about Me Too, Black Lives Matter, they're having an impact where before we didn't. And the question I ask in the book is, well, in the light of this, how shall we live? And this was a big question before COVID, but it's even bigger now. And we have to recognize that fundamental challenges to the way that particularly my generation, the older generation, think are arising as a result of some of this social activism. And then the fourth one is, what does all of this mean for organizations? Because in the book, I look at a number of highly innovative but humane organizations that have very high levels of employee engagement and productivity. Yes, organizations in the commercial world, but also organizations in the not-for-profit sector and education sectors. And it seems to me that the old ways of structuring organizations so that they were hierarchical and knowledge and power trickle down, they no longer work in this new world that I've just been describing. So we have to find ways. The message of the book is we have to find ways of working with the people who work in our organizations and recognizing that they are innovators too, but so are the users of our products and services. And this is particularly pertinent for education. And we have to find ways to work with them, not to create products and services on their behalf. That's why the strapline of the book is how we connect, act, and innovate together. There seems to be a delay on the line.
Sorry, David. Yes, there's a delay, and there are funny things. I started muted, and there's a lot of people behind the screen that the audience might imagine only you and me, but there's many people organizing this. There are the translators, there are all the technical stuff behind it, and we're experiencing some sound problems. So apologies if it's taking too long between one answer and the other. And the funny thing is that I was listening to you double and with delay, so I kind of I think I could understand everything you said, but apologies if I ask you to repeat some of the aspects. So we are here in the event about fixing the future and the future of education particularly, but I would like to stop for a while in the idea that imagined futures are always shaped by the present we live in. our imagination is completely tainted by our current experience. So the present is definitely pandemics, vaccines, and restrictive measures for Christmas gatherings, along with an unprecedented digital intensity. But at the same time, we have seen during the pandemics how citizens responded amidst the lack of scrap, for instance, or face masks. So people was gathering together in order to use 3D printers or any other technological solutions that they had close to their homes or even in their neighborhoods in order to help to produce to avoid the shortage of materials. So what are the trends that lead us to this people-powered innovation?
Well, in the book, I talk about a number of them. I think that there are about 6, it seems to me, but some are more important than others. And I think one of the trends that's been happening for some time now, which is going to have a huge impact on our young people, and in fact it already is what's being called the crisis of identity. And this has come about as a result of a number of challenges. You know, we've got automation and artificial intelligence. We always seem to view those things as threats instead of opportunities, but it will certainly affect the job market. And we have to recognize that when we talk to young people, we say, what do you want to do when you grow up? You know, all of our conversations are conditioned around the idea of a job. And I think what I say in the book is, let's not talk so much about jobs as what occupies us. And I mean that in the sense of the occupation, because I think in the future we're going to have to define ourselves by what we are interested in and by what we do, rather than how we earn a living. And then I guess the other one, which I haven't mentioned up to now, is this idea of a quest for self-determination. You know, we're about to see the exit, or maybe not, but hopefully we are about to see the exit of a president in the US who led his campaign by saying, only I can fix this. There was a kind of learned helplessness on the one hand, and that's how authoritarianism works. But at the same time, we all have a quest to have more control in our lives. And we're starting to see that now, partly through the technology. And I think that has been seeping out of the social spaces that we inhabit and more into the workspaces and gradually into the education spaces. So what does that mean for educators? It seems to me that we have to co-create the curriculum, we have to co-create the learning so that young people feel more in control of their learning. They, I think, are the 2 key trends.
So clear. Actually, as you were talking about job market and occupation, I was reminding a sentence by Esko Kilpi, which he was saying that working means to be resolving others' problems. So I think that this completely resonates with meaning that you were sharing with us. I'm happy to say that we are already receiving many questions from our audience, and one of them, it's connected to this idea of the co-creation or participation of the students, as you were already depicting. And it's true that the digital revolution is much more than data economy and Internet of Things, despite this is what it's in the headlines every day. But it's also reshaping how do we relate to others, right? It's also how do we perceive hierarchies and how we define the us versus them. And as digital environments such as social media, for instance, are fostering two-way conversation, it's not longer a one-way direction only. We have been told that we are no longer consumers, but also prosumers. And in your book, still, you have identified that users and producers hold different mindsets. How do you think this relates to innovation, and to what extent could be a useful framework to reshape education ecosystems?
Well, let's start outside of education, and then we can come back into education. If you think of the journey that most people make who are working in the commercial sector, they start off with a user mindset. They're driven by passion. It may be a hobby. You know, the launch of the world's first personal computer really was the two Steves, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, attending a hobbyist club. They then became producers when they established Apple. And I think this is a common journey that people make. And it seems to me that the mindset begins to shift, and that gradually in our organizations, the producer mindset, which people can see on the screen, some of the things that the drivers of producers are very different to those users. And if we are now saying in terms of education that we need to work more with users, then I think we need to understand the mindset, because it is very different. And what I try to say in the book is we can't ignore the fact that user innovation is happening and it's growing. You could decide that you were going to try to squash it, to stop it, to prevent it, or you could decide that you can work with it. And commercially, I talk about the craft brewery in Scotland, Brewdog, who works with users, and they co-create new recipes for beer. That's a good example of using that community as co-creators. I don't think that in education, I don't think we've really done that well enough, or in a mass participation basis. So I think that's one of the challenges that inevitably we will face, because let's face it, people are doing things much more for themselves, and that includes learning.
Definitely, and following with this path you were suggesting now about learning during this pandemic, we have also seen in different countries how some sectors of population are left behind or are being pointed as part of the problem, and one of these collectives is youth. And it's a kind of paradoxical, because the same young leaders who are fighting against climate change or discrimination can be at the same time school dropouts. And I'm sure that probably the audience is thinking about Greta Thunberg, but you have found many other examples in your 3-year journey, seeking for innovations. And I would like to elaborate, for you to elaborate a little bit more about the amazing social activism that characterizes young these days, and how education systems could align what they do in school with what they need to do in order to save the planet, for instance.
Absolutely, because the two are not separate. We need to be developing education systems beyond COVID, which is going to help save the planet. I consider it one of the privileges of my life to work with some of these young people. The thing that seems to mark them out, and that's different to my generation, is that they're not driven by money. One of the first young people to respond to the pandemic in the US was a young kid, he's 17, called Avi Schiffman. And Avi created this COVID tracking website, which is still the most authoritative source in the US of case numbers. And Avi did this as a hobby, but at the same time, of course, he's still in school. And Avi describes himself as a really bad student because he had a 1.7 grade point average. So the scale in the US goes from 0 to 4. So 1.7 wouldn't be considered particularly good. But Avi turned down, I think it was about $8 million. Someone tried to buy his website and he turned that down. And shortly after that, he created a website in the wake of the George Floyd murders, which was tracking those protests. He has recently been awarded the Webby Person of the Year, which is like the Oscars for web design. And yet, he's considered to be not a particularly gifted student. So there's something wrong with our system. And then I meet these young people all the time. And only just a couple of weeks ago, I met this amazing young woman from Colombia called Sophia Leal. And as a school project, to go to the question, how do we bring this in to our schools? Sophia decided that she wanted to create a thing called Neglu. You can see it now on the screen, that's Sophia. And Neglu is a easily transportable, lightweight form of temporary housing for people who've been affected by natural disasters, who've lost their homes. One of the really thrilling parts of it is the way in which these young people are connecting. So Sophia is now looking for funding so that she can scale the production up. And she's 15, she lives near Bogota. And there is a young English boy called Jacob Bell, who is currently at this very moment selling candles to raise money, which he can then pass on to Sophia to make sure that Neglu becomes a real, it's not just a prototype. And, you know, Sophia has presented at the United Nations. These are amazing young people. And although they are extraordinary, they're by no means exceptions. I've met them in every country that I've visited. And I think we just have to recognize that they are connecting with one another and they are taking social action. What we have to do in schools is to say, that's great. Do that when you're in school, not after school.
It's a complete change of mindset that things can happen not after school in your hobby time, but also within this learning ecosystems. And actually, I would like to ask you also, maybe these young entrepreneurs that you have found are also connected to environments that are supportive or that are somehow helping them to thrive, or at least that are not putting them barriers in order to develop and follow their instincts. Let's frame it like this. So how could we provide students with education environments, so to speak, schools and beyond, of course, and learning ecosystems as a wider concept that can help them to thrive, actually? So in other words, could we reshape education under the lens of UI mindset? And in that case, what would be the role of families, teachers, public administrations, decision makers, and other relevant stakeholders in civic life? What's your point on that?
Well, I'm glad that you talked about families and communities, because I think that ecosystem phrase is now being used much more in terms of how we go forward with our education systems. And I was listening back to Edward's contribution to this series, when he talked about the need to engage parents, and I think that's vital. I think that schools should be doing work that matters to young people. We've seen this growing interest in things like project-based learning, but we also need to go beyond that, I think, and give students an involvement in the way in which schools see their relation to their community. Let me give you an example of this, which I quote in the book, which is, there is a school in North Carolina in America, and it's not a wealthy school. It's called Tri-County Early College. And they were trying to do what I think everyone who's talked in this series would recognize, future-focused education. But they were having an issue with their parents because they had a fixed mindset about what a school should look like, and it should look like kids in rows being taught by a teacher. And so they said, we need to find a better way to get our message across. And the students themselves said, let us do that. Let us be the marketing team for this school. Let us redesign the website, because as we know, young people are going to do a much better job of a website redesign than we would. And that's what happened. In that school, the principal said, okay, you are in charge of all the marketing. And when you think about it, it makes total sense, because many schools have got slick kind of YouTube videos about what they do and what they stand for. That isn't as powerful as hearing a student stand up in a community meeting and talking about what their learning has meant to them. So I think that's, it doesn't have to be a whole-scale radical revolution within a school, but I think we do have to think of ways of building that ecosystem, which isn't just the parents, because we do have to change some of those parental perceptions, but it's also our community, and how schools, I think, going beyond COVID, can see themselves as the restorers of community. Because I don't know what it's like in Spain currently, but it's certainly here in the UK, our communities have been decimated by this pandemic. Our city centres have been turned into ghost towns, and we have to find ways to rebuild that. Well, the people who can help us, the only people who can help us, are in our schools right now. So let's not wait until they've left school to do that. Let's see the purpose of our schools as being to rebuild our communities, not to get students through a standardized test.
That's really true what you're mentioning now. And you were asking what's the scenario in Spain at the moment, and I would say at the moment our city centers are not empty, maybe as in the UK, as you were referring now. But it's true that during the pandemic and particularly during the lockdown, so the most difficult weeks back in spring, I think that this idea of the educational ecosystem was pretty clear for everyone, because families realized what are schools bringing to the equation, and schools were also learning what other stakeholders beyond families are also bringing into the equation in terms of inclusion and digital access, and also how connections matter, and how are you accompanying the education and the processes, and also the emotional coping of this pandemic. And at this point, let me share with you a question by Sarada Kalavapudi, because it's really connected to these examples that you were mentioning now, that you have been finding in different schools. And actually, Sarada is asking, what is the way to enable and encourage educators to co-create and be more user-focused? So you have explained us the part of how can we incorporate our students as users and co-creators, but how can we enable and encourage educators as well?
Well, it seems to me we have to start at the top in terms of our policymakers. Because in the eyes of many policymakers, they would not necessarily see this as a teacher's role to be having those kinds of conversations with young people. But certainly a few years ago, I worked on an initiative where we had a group of schools who actually asked the students to be researchers. They set it up as a kind of commission around learning, what great learning would look like. And it's remarkable when you get students involved in the process of learning and what makes for effective and enjoyable learning, they always exceed one's expectations. And I find the same thing around parents. So as an educator, what I often do is I go around and I run parent workshops in schools with teachers and with parents. And it's always interesting to see the two different mindsets at work. But ultimately, what I always end up saying at the end of the evening is what we've done, which is to look at the future, the kind of things that we've been talking about, to look at different learning approaches and different learning theories, which parents are interested in. It's a myth that they're not. But I always say, what we've just done, you didn't need me to do that. Anyone can do this. We just need to revision our role of parents and see them as people who can help us deliver that learning. And I think that's going more broadly, that's how we have to move forward, because we still have some governments who, don't want to see this change, even though the pandemic has forced us to think differently about the world of work and about education, about online learning, about so many things. But I think we still have some governments who just want to get back to normal. And it seems to me that's a wasted opportunity. But the only people that they will really listen to are the voters, and they are parents, generally speaking. So the first challenge, I think, as educators is to bring parents into the conversation about what is the kind of education we want going forward here.
Probably that's a crucial question. And there are many people from the audience that are asking whether this new shift in conceiving education can create new divisions in society or new divides, right? So those who are able to upgrade or to understand and to deploy this new mindset based on co-creation, and those who are not in there yet. What's your opinion on that? Or have you seen countries where you have seen these two paces?
You know, what and others have talked about this, so I won't spend much time on it, but what the pandemic has done is to throw up the inequality in our education systems, which is really just a reflection of the inequality in our society. So we're always faced with that dilemma. This is a question that I get asked all of the time, but it seems to me that just because we may not be able to get every child in the world to have this kind of education doesn't mean to say that we do nothing. And I think what's been really interesting in the past 5 to 10 years or so has been the way in which those people who have maybe become wealthy through the startup industry, through the tech industry, have become interested in schools because they have young children, and they're now starting to build their own schools. There's one in Barcelona, Learn Life. And sometimes those innovators who bring a different kind of mindset, they do bring that user innovator mindset that I talked about. Sometimes it seems to me they are told that, you know, they're not really educators. What right do they have to tell teachers how it should be? I welcome it, because I think what they've brought is a challenge to our traditional ways of seeing it. You know, education hasn't really changed that much in the past 140 years. So I think I welcome the fact that we are now starting to see other people who are coming into that conversation and saying, hey, you know, we could learn from the commercial sector. We could learn from the cooperative movement. There are lots of different places that we can learn from, not least the growth of homeschooling and the growth of what I call DIY learning, which is teachers and students who are coming together now and setting up almost pop-up kinds of schools where that distinction between a teacher and a learner is blurred. And so that do-it-yourself nature of what I described is really starting to challenge, I think, what we think of as a school, what it should look like.
Definitely, this idea of this interconnected world, which is blurring the boundaries between who is learning and who is teaching, and the other way around. And you were also mentioning homeschooling, and actually Arun G is asking, so his perception is that homeschooling, it's gaining prominence in recent times, probably due to the pandemics and lockdowns. And his question is, do the students gain more in terms of creativity or skills? Do you see any relation between homeschooling and creativity and other soft skills?
That's why the past 12 months is going to be fascinating when we look back in, 4 or 5 years' time, and it seems to me that there are already question marks about standardized tests and whether it's right that the students have had their learning disrupted. But their learning in school may have been disrupted, but for many students, not all, I accept, but for many students, actually being in control of their own learning at home has been liberating. And I was speaking to some educators last night in Melbourne who were saying, for some of our students, the ability to be able to plan their own learning schedule has been fantastic. And the challenge, it seems to me, is as we go forward, we need to have this hybrid model of learning. So some of it can be done online, some of it needs to be face-to-face. So I think we need to rethink that balance, but also let's look at what good has come out of this past 12 months. And homeschoolers, it seems to me, are a really interesting case in point, because it used to be that if you were a parent who was homeschooling, you were quite isolated and you felt the pressure of having to deliver all of that yourself. Now we see homeschoolers who are networked and really much better organized. They've formed really powerful associations of learners. And I think those of us who are working in mainstream education have a lot that we could learn from these kind of radical models of education. So rather than try and perhaps prevent it, I know some of our government is in the UK has expressed concerns about homeschooling. Okay, I understand those concerns, but let's also look at what we can learn from that environment.
Definitely, and connected to what you were saying now, I remember some conversations with educators or school principals that they were saying that they were concerned back in spring because they were not able to evaluate their students in the same fashion as they have been for the last decades. But in one specific school close to Barcelona, and it's a public school with complex diversity among the students, so it's not in a wealthy area. Let's frame it like this. They were experimenting on new ways of evaluating. So they were not doing any kind of test, but they were offering open-ended questions to students. So something like, what did you learn this week? And where did you find the information? What were your sources of information? What was your initial curiosity that ignited your research connected to the students as researchers, as you were saying before? So it's really interesting that if we could have our eyes open to that, this pandemic could be actually a catalyzer for this change in the mindset of schools. And if you'd like to also cover a little bit about the skills, we have talked about creativity and how homeschooling can open new opportunities in terms of new skills. Many people in the audience is asking as well, what kind of skills are going to be needed in the future, not only in the future of jobs or in the future of work, but also in future societies, right? We have been reading that Harari says that by 2050, we will see the emergence of a new useless class, which is not going to be employed or employable. And also the World Economic Forum calculates that 65% of pupils that today are sitting at primary education will be employed in jobs that we cannot even imagine yet. So amidst this scenario of uncertainty and disruption, with these two poles as overarching themes, in any conversation about the future of work and workers, then the question comes that what are the basic skills for every citizen, not only for work, but to participate, connect, learn, and innovate? And how can we embed these skills in early education stages?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I think we do have to be honest and recognize that even before COVID, our young people were facing a tough couple of decades. And it always amazes me to see that they have so little kind of resentment or cynicism, because I always use the phrase that my generation, the baby boomers, we had the party, but you know, they have the hangover now. And for many of them, the idea of, you know, a pension or a house of their own, if they haven't got wealthy parents, then there's an awful lot of challenges. But at the same time, it seems to me that we are at a point in our development as a society where we can actually see some huge, significant benefits. We're probably moving quite close to a point where energy, for example, becomes too cheap to monitor. You know, hydrogen power is going to transform our cities and the way we move. We've also got organized companies in the knowledge sector who are making vast profits through automation. You know, you just have to look at Amazon to see what that looks like when they've got robots who are doing the work that used to belong to people. So it isn't a question of there isn't enough money to go around in this future. Once we get beyond this, you know, this recession that we're all going to be entering into. So I think it gives us an opportunity as a society to say, what does a life well lived look like? And given the kind of challenges that we're all facing now around the world, the climate emergency, the challenges of mass migration, some of which are caused through the climate emergency, the fact that we will have some people, as Harari says, who, despite their best efforts, may not be able to get this thing that we call a job, and yet we also have this incredible power of artificial intelligence and automation to take away from us the kinds of aspects of work that we never wanted to do. So why can't we flip that on its head and say to our young people, we will give you, whether it's a universal basic income or some other kind of financial reward, but we want you to work on these big global challenges, or we want you to end the problem of loneliness. You know, we have a situation now in Japan where young people can no longer visit their aged relatives in care homes because they're working 2 or 3 jobs. And so they now create these robots who are these buddies for these senior citizens in Japanese care homes. That to me seems to be, there's something wrong with this picture. And I think what we have to say, to go back to the original question of what are the skills that we need to develop, the skills that we need to develop, it seems to me, are the ones that make us human. Because robots are brilliant at doing many things, but they're terrible at being human. So that, it seems to me, those qualities of empathy, of compassion, they're going to become absolutely critical in the next 10, 20 years. But also lateral thinking, how we solve problems. You know, we are still, for the moment at least, we are still ahead of artificial intelligence and automation in terms of our creativity. So that's what our education systems seem to need to focus on over the next 10 to 20 years.
Definitely. It's interesting that you're mentioning empathy and compassion, and also lateral thinking. And I also remember another conversation with someone in the education system that was telling, you know what, there's something wrong here, because we are trying to teach kids to learn code. So we want kids to be coding all the time, and we want robots to be human. So we are missing something, or we are misunderstanding something here, right? And regarding, you were also mentioning like programs of basic income and so on. And it's interesting also because it's not only opening a conversation about education and interaction and participation, it's also about rethinking completely the safety nets and the social contract that in most countries we agreed on after the World War II. So probably the disruption that we are facing nowadays, it's clear there, right? Even though we are not still aware of all the magnitude of it. And opening a little bit the scope, we have a very interesting question by Sushanta Chaudhary, and it's where he's asking that in the third world countries, all parents are not educated and teachers are not highly efficient. So in this case, how students can receive support to speed up this change in the mindset that you were saying before. And I don't know here if maybe we could, I don't know, if we are under the user-centric approach, what if we could connect students from one advantage school with students from a third world school?
There is a school that I visited in India, in New Delhi, which was a very privileged independent school, but they recognized that they had a responsibility, and they ran a few programs that the students got involved in. One was Each One Teach One, so each student that could read had to go out into the villages and help those kids who couldn't read. And they also had a thing called Adopt a Granny, which was in the villages in India. A lot of the young men are moving into the cities. The grandfathers are dying, and we had a lot of grandmothers who were left isolated. And so they saw it as part of their responsibility to support that and to enable the fabric of the society to thrive. And to go back to the user innovation thing, in Africa, it's not well known, but half of all mobile banking innovations have come from users themselves, and that tends to be people who are not wealthy, but they have a mobile phone. And what we're seeing now is that the technology is driving the pace of change in these developing countries, and that has to have an impact upon education systems. So a friend of mine, Sandy Puda, set up some schools in Gurgaon, just outside New Delhi, called the Vega schools, and they really are kind of forward-thinking, 21st century focused schools. And we're starting to see that kind of movement growing. There is a real opportunity, it seems to me, in the developing world to almost leapfrog 100 years of, let's face it, in the West, it was fairly static development, incremental change in education. These developing countries, given the fact that the technology is everywhere now, they have a real opportunity to make huge strides in terms of their development. And you only have to look at the Middle East, and I feature Dubai in there in terms of their transformation of the education system and what they're doing now. And 20 years ago, that was a desert. So the speed at which that educational change can happen, I think, will differ dramatically in the developing world. In the Western industrialized world, I think part of the problem is that we're bogged down with this history and tradition and perception of what education should look like.
Indeed. And also, do you think that in countries where the welfare state is well deployed and it's expanded, there's less flexibility for these twists, for these disruptive changes? Because innovation cannot be so it's difficult that bottom-up innovation comes easily and thrives easily. Whilst in other countries with looser states or welfare states are more keen to innovation and to testing things.
I think it's a mixed picture, and I see this all the time in terms of people who make comparisons about independent private schools and the level of innovation that they adopt, and say government schools who don't have so much money. I'd have to say that in, 30 years of working in education, I've seen really highly innovative independent schools, and I've seen highly innovative government schools that don't have the money, because good ideas don't cost anything. You know, I accept that, you know, every child going forward needs to have access to the internet and needs to have a laptop. That just should be a fundamental human right, like water or clean air. But beyond that, I've seen schools in really depressed parts of the world who are doing incredible things. And I think we have to create a kind of ecosystem whereby those schools can share what they've been doing. So the kind of schools I talk about in the book are all kind of involved in global networks, and they're willing to share what's worked for them and also what's not worked. And if it's good enough for our students to be networking and sharing ideas and creating together, then surely it's good enough for us as educators.
Indeed. Pipi Barbieri was sharing in the chat that actually his or her concern about how can we create alternative ways to exchange and to expand ideas without money, because actually literally the sentence says many local things are happening in Michigan, and I guess this means many local things, or many of the examples are happening in the US. And one of the interesting aspects of your book, and it can also be confirmed by the wide range of examples that you are mentioning from across the different countries and different continents, and I think that it's adding value because it's not innovation by the usual suspects or by northern countries only, right? So I think that this is really, really valuable and something differential that you are bringing with your book. So Pipi Barbieri might be happy by your answer here as well.
Could I just add to that, Liliana, which is, you know, I talk about this concept in the book of jugaad innovation, which is an Indian term, which really reflects some of the incredible creativity that we see in slums in India. People doing amazing things with next to nothing. Now, align that alongside one of the big trends that I've seen in the past 3-4 years, which is something called cosmo-localism. And the idea is that what used to be a high premium, which was knowledge, is now being shared everywhere around the world. But what used to be commonly shared is now being developed locally, which is the actual production of the materials. So we saw this in COVID. We saw open source designs for face shields, which were then produced very cheaply locally. And I think this is going to be the way forward. There's a guy in Melbourne in Australia who makes prosthetic limbs at much cheaper than you can buy commercially available. And he has now made those designs free for anyone to do, and shows you how you can make a prosthetic limb for $10 or less. I think this opening of knowledge means that countries that are certainly still at a disadvantage in terms of their development, so long as you have a mobile phone now, you can get access to that knowledge. 20 years ago, you were at a major disadvantage, but I think the world is starting to change, and I hope that the amount of money that you have is not necessarily related to the level of innovation that you can bring.
Definitely really clear. And in the chat, they are sharing also some increase about the future of online education. And as you were mentioning, that if you have a phone, you have access to a wide body of knowledge. I'm thinking about formats like MOOCs, like massive online courses, right? And also Luisa is asking, what will be the role of universities, international certifications, and now that the world has moved online? Is this going to represent a new opportunity, a challenge? What kind of opportunity can bring us? And I'm also reminding Mimi, which was saying streaming services, Netflix, $14 per month, HBO, I don't know, a similar amount, Harvard, $10,000 a year, right? So what are the opportunities that we can unlock there?
I think it's a great question. I think one of the challenges now that we're starting to see is that the value of a degree is diminishing. So a lot of the major employers, people like Google or Ernst & Young, they're saying, we're not interested in your degree. Show us what you've done. Show us what you can do with what you know, not just what you know. So that then throws into question the value of universities and going to college. And I want to say straight from the off, there are many other reasons for going to college, and I was grateful that I went, even though I was a mature student. But I think the challenge that has been thrown to our higher education sector has been possibly the most dramatic of all of them, because we are now having to rethink what we mean by an education in terms of Edward talked about this, how we still lump people into individual disciplines, and we have degrees which are in chemistry or mathematics. There's a very interesting development in London now, which is taking place, which is called the London Interdisciplinary School, where you actually sign up to solve a major world problem, like how do we bring an end to malaria? And that would reflect that interdisciplinary world that exists beyond education. And I think the other challenge that universities are going to have to face is they're going to have to relate more to their communities. They're going to have to offer a much more flexible and in some ways cheaper. I know they've kind of pioneered the MOOC movement, and I'm grateful that they've done that. But I think the idea of micro-credentialing, that's going to become more popular. And the reality is every single person on the planet now, below the age of 40, is going to have to be learning and relearning as they go through their life, because their working life is probably going to go into late 70s. But the jobs that they do, or the occupations that occupy them, they are going to change, and they will change constantly. They'll have to find their own ways to adapt, and the universities have got a huge part to play. You know, we've been talking about lifelong learning for 20 years maybe. It's here now. Now is the reality. We need lifelong learning, and the universities need to step up to show how they'll provide that.
Definitely. Actually, we have new terms of, not really new, but we are starting to use them widely, like reskilling, upskilling, as different ways to concrete this long life learning. And let me just share an anecdote now that you mentioned interdisciplinarity and breaking silos between fields of knowledge. Because the other day I was sitting in a room which was gathering many experts on artificial intelligence, and they were trying to start like an ethics committee, and 80% of the committee was people from engineering backgrounds, so STEM, and 20% of the room we were sitting social scientists, philosophers, and so on and so forth. And it was interesting because it's not, as you were saying before, connections matter, and the kind of community you create matter, and it's altering the results that you can get, because it's not just it's not just as simple as sitting people around the table. It's in order to develop interdisciplinarity, but in a sense that also encompasses compassion and empathy and new abilities of listening to each other and understanding each other. So it's interesting that you were also mentioning interdisciplinarity. So, well, I think that we are almost out of time, and thank you to the audience that has been sharing many interesting questions with us. I'm sorry we could not make it to include all of them, but I would like just to give a final word and thank again David for sharing this afternoon with us. And I really recommend you to read The Power of Us. It's a thought-provoking and incisive book, which is not only for educators, but also for leaders, teams, individuals, and anyone who is aiming to challenge the status quo, regardless what's your definition of status quo. And also, it's not only about theory, as we were saying before, it's a 3-year journey with an international and cross-country perspective, and it's really ethnographic, I would say, in a sense, and also practical, because it's offering a toolkit. So before we hand over and before we invite Sylvia to get the floor again, David, I don't know if you would like to give like a last idea for our audience tonight.
Well, only to say this, really. I think in this world that is changing, and the world that I try to present in the book, it seems to me that culture really matters. The culture of our organizations. If we want people to be innovative, then we need to focus on the culture, and we need to focus on things like equity and diversity and empathy. And I think the commercial world is starting to change, and the education world also needs to think about what should our internal culture look like. If we focus on culture, we'll be okay.
So the crucial point is culture. I think that it's a very nice closing for this session today. So thank you, David. And Sylvia, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David and Liliana, for this lovely and inspiring conversation. I think it has been really a great closing of our 7-day journey around the world of education. Thank you for that. And thank you, you all who have followed us from home since October, asking so many interesting questions. We hope that you enjoyed the series, and we are looking forward to receiving your feedback about it. Remember that all the talks of Fixing the Future will remain online in English and in Catalan in our YouTube channel. And from now on, if you think you will be missing your weekly dose of future optimism, just sign up to our newsletter and follow us in the social Atlas of the Future. You will see that it is actually possible to fix the future one project at a time. So, till next time.